Hello, today our presentation is about the urbanization of a second-tier city and urban growth regime in post-developmental state. My name is HaeRan Shin. I'm teaching in the Department of Geography at Seoul National University. Sang-won Choi, my collaborator, is a postgraduate student in the same department. We are using the case of Gimpo, South Korea. This city is located next to Seoul. South Korea is a highly industrialized society, but the city of Gimpo has been under the growth management of the Seoul capital area because of the overwhelming growth of the area. However, the state's control became decentralized since the 1990s. And we are looking at the emergence, dramatic emergence of informal factories. The informal factories are located in the middle of houses and then in the middle of agricultural fields. We call them informal factories because each factory hires fewer than 10 employees, sometimes 1 or 2, and then those employees earn low wages, and many of them are migrant workers, and they contributed to informalizing the urban landscape. And there have been more than 10,000 factories in the city since the 1990s. And this is Daegot, a representative area, and then you can see the blue and green roofs. They are informal factories, and there are more than 2,600 ones, and more than 4,000 migrant workers are working there. And this is an ad done by private developers for informal factories. So they add that they will build this kind of informal housing for migrant workers first and the informal factories so that those migrant workers don't have to commute. So we were wondering why this kind of a thing, the emergence of informal factories has been going on, and who has led such urbanization as a response to state transformation. And we also ask, is this a East Asian growth regime similar to the dominant Western paradigm, or is it very different? Our main arguments are like this, and Sang-won is going to talk about them in details later. The concept of a growth regime has been dominant in the studies of urban growth and development for the several decades. And then the growth regime is a collaboration between governmental and non-governmental organizations. And the East Asian context tells a different story because the nation state was so strong, and there was a states regulation and promotion, and the local governments were not really visible or actually didn't exist. So, but later the nation states went through significant changes, and the local actors and then local cities responded accordingly. So in this kind of a context, we ask what kind of a growth regime emerged in the context. And so the formation of a growth regime depends on the characteristics of a nation state and the relationship between the state and the local cities. So we are criticizing that the dynamics of growth regimes in the East Asian context has not received enough attention. So we suggest here re-evaluating the growth regime debate in terms of Asian developmental state. The Korean state has had a strong state intervention, especially during the 1970s and 80s. So earlier, Molotchi says that the city was a growth machine itself, and in the Korean context, the state was the growth machine itself. But the Seoul capital area was strictly regulated by the national government because of the very consequences of a fast growth. So state transformation in the 1990s influenced many things. Well, there have been significant changes. For example, business activities became internationalized, labor movement emerged, nation state control over the domestic market significantly reduced, and then there was a shift to knowledge, service, or high-tech oriented sectors. Besides, in politics, local elections started in 1994. So it means that local governments became one of the key actors, and then they emphasized global competitiveness. So the state and the local government's roles were quite interesting because they continued to regulate, on the one hand, something like urban informality, but on the other hand, they promoted it for economic growth and political governance. And in terms of the competition of becoming worlding cities, local cities, especially second-tier cities, secondary cities, really struggled to survive. So here, survival strategies were much more emphasized than before. For our analysis, we conducted various research methods. First, we conducted in-depth interviews and on-spot informal interviews and focus groups, participant observations, and site visits. We also analyzed archives, including newspaper articles, policy papers, and others.
Okay, let me give you the main argument of our paper. The first part is state transformation and deregulation for the Seoul capital area. Since 1960s, there was developmental state in South Korea ruled by military dictatorship. And the developmental state pursued a Seoul-oriented growth strategy. And in that process, second-tier cities like Gimpo had been marginalized. So they become locations for left-behind industries. But since 1990s, globalization and global competition among countries and cities have increased. So the South Korean developmental state has transformed to a neoliberal state with a developmental approach. And we argue that the capital region management law is an articulated example that shows the nature of the neoliberal state with a developmental approach. The law is a legal and institutional guidance for the development of informal factories. And according to that law, there are 5 different zones dividing Seoul capital area, and second-tier cities like Gimpo belongs to growth management zone. The second part of our finding is the emergence of the growth regime led by Lee Jang-s. In the context of the state transformation, Gimpo's urban growth regime has emerged. And we see the Gimpo's urban growth regime as an encounter of local actors' spatial strategies. Local actors are city government, village leaders, landowners, factory owners, architects, and migrant workers. First of all, Gimpo city government play passive role. As a city government, they have to promote urban growth without hurting their own reputation. So when it comes to informal factories, they neither promote nor regulate those informal factories. Instead, they actively develop industrial parks to screen the rapid increase of those informal factories. As I quoted here, the Gimpo city government official said, as a matter of fact, it is not too bad because it helps with the economy of the city, you know. And here comes the most important part of our finding, the dominating role of Lee Jang-s. Those ijangs have a historical background. They were pioneer of urbanization and modernization, motivated by the developmental state. But since 1990s, they have led the entire processes of informal factory development. They network landowners, developers, architects, realtors, city government officials, and also they cover public complaints caused by those informal factories. This dominating role of Ijang was possible because of their distinctive characteristics. They are half public, half private agents. As you can see in this picture, they get together periodically to discuss about the Gimpo's public affairs. And at the same time, in most cases, those ijangs are landowners. So naturally, they mediate the public-private partnership, and also they internalize the partnership in themselves. So ijangs are a manifestation of localized developmentalism and survival rationality. And other growth regime actors, landowners and real estate agencies, they become motivated interest groups due to the increased land price. And factory owners who need accessibility to Seoul with relatively low costs find an opportunity in second-tier cities like Gimpo. And migrant workers, both enablers and consequences of urban growth, find, of course, the opportunity in informal factors because they need stable job, and at the same time, informal factories find opportunity because they need low-wage employees. And we can also find the emergence of anti-growth regimes. There are groups of residents who criticize the environmental impact of informal factories. And due to that criticism, some factories are closed. But currently, those anti-growth regimes are less influential than the urban growth regime. Yes, implications. By analyzing the Gimpo's case, we say in the urbanization process, the informality of second-tier cities cushions the system, absorbing the shocks of urban growth from first-tier cities, while at the same time demonstrating that cities such as Gimpo can grow in their own way. Thank you for listening.